Kyle's phone vibrated in his hand, and looking down, he saw his eldest son's name on the screen. The boy needed to talk. His marriage, barely 2 years old, was already in trouble. He suspected his wife was cheating on him. A familiar knot of anxiety tightened in Kyle's stomach. He had been through this before. "I'm with you," he reassured his son, though inside he didn't feel as confident as he sounded. The truth was, he had buried these memories a long time ago, but now they were surfacing again, forcing him to face barely healed wounds. But this was his son, his flesh and blood, asking for advice. Kyle had weathered the storm of betrayal with his ex-wife many years ago. He couldn't turn away from his son, especially now when he had something, anything to offer, lessons learned the hard way. Settling into his old chair with a notebook ready, Kyle braced himself for the painful memories that were about to resurface. This wouldn't be easy, but how could he let his son navigate this emotional battlefield alone? The memories came flooding back in vivid detail, despite the time that had passed. Kyle's thoughts drifted to his school years, back to the 3rd grade, when he first noticed Megan. She was the untouchable queen of their class, her golden hair cascading down her back, her figure catching the eye of every boy, and her eyes so blue you could drown in them. Everyone wanted to be around her. As for Kyle, he didn't stand a chance. Not then. He was just another awkward teenager with long limbs and a complete lack of charm, blending into the background of any social scene. If Grace were a dance, Kyle would have been the guy tripping over his own feet. But life often throws us into unexpected situations. It happened at Megan's 18th birthday party. Kyle hadn't even been invited, but somehow managed to tag along with someone he barely knew. And there she was, floating across the room like a goddess. To his surprise, their eyes met across the crowd, and she smiled. Not just a fleeting smile, but a real, unmistakable one. Before Kyle could process what was happening, Megan approached him. She kissed him, right in the middle of the party, without saying a word. Then, as casually as she had appeared, she returned to her giant boyfriend. His name was Alexander, if Kyle remembered correctly, who looked like he could tear Kyle in half. But at that moment, Kyle didn't care. He was on top of the world, enchanted by the girl who had never noticed him before. It was like a scene from a cheap teen movie. Megan was the dream girl, and Kyle? He was the invisible guy who finally got his moment. Despite the odds, Kyle decided to win her over, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Slowly but surely, Kyle began climbing the social ladder. By the time prom came around, Megan was on his arm. Thankfully, Megan's parents had made sure Alexander was out of the picture by then. That summer, with graduation behind them, Kyle and Megan were swept up in a whirlwind of young love, convinced they were meant to be together forever. Kyle felt invincible. If only he had known what was coming. When fall arrived, Kyle enrolled in a local college, aiming to become a math teacher. Megan moved into a dorm near the hospital, pursuing her dream of becoming a nurse. The 20 miles between them felt like an insurmountable distance. The next 4 years passed in a blur, with Kyle juggling classes and part-time jobs. Keeping the relationship alive seemed impossible. Then came the blow that changed everything. Kyle's father collapsed at work, struck by a catastrophic brain hemorrhage. The doctors performed emergency surgery, cutting into his skull to salvage whatever they could. The scar was so deep, you could see it from across the room. Kyle's father's company offered him a meager pension, and in an instant, the man who had always been their rock became a shadow, confined to a chair, barely functioning. Kyle's mother had to take on the financial burden, leaving Kyle to care for his younger siblings. His brother Michael spiraled out of control, skipping school, and his grades plummeted. Kyle lost count of how many times he had to clean up after Michael's messes. And then there was Bethany, his younger sister, whose beauty only attracted trouble. She had a knack for drawing the attention of boys much older than her, and Kyle became her reluctant protector, chasing them away one by one. But the real blow came from his mother. When their father could no longer be the man he once was, she began frequenting the local bar, seeking comfort that went far beyond just a drink. Kyle wasn't naive. He understood all too well what those late nights at the office really meant. His father understood too, though he never uttered a word. The indescribable sadness in his eyes said it all, as if he was crumbling before them piece by piece with each painful moment. When his father finally passed away, something inside Kyle's mother broke for good. She wandered the house like a ghost, weighed down by grief and guilt, becoming a shadow of her former self. Around that same time, Kyle's relationship with Megan started to fall apart. They broke up several times only to get back together again. But looking back, Kyle realized that these breaks were probably Megan's way of exploring other options. He tried to ignore the slowly growing doubts, the constant suspicions gnawing at him. But over time, paranoia took over. He began calling Megan's dorm regularly, only to be brushed off by her roommates who made excuses. They said Megan was too upset to talk because of Kyle's unpredictable behavior. But Kyle knew they were lying. He was the best thing that ever happened to her, and he couldn't understand why everything was falling apart. In desperation, he started lurking outside her dorm, hoping to catch her in an act of infidelity. But Megan was too smart to make a mistake. All Kyle achieved was losing his own sanity. Eventually, he graduated from college and took a job teaching math at a middle school. Meanwhile, Megan got a job at a pediatric clinic near their hometown. They got married, had a beautiful wedding, and started building a life together. A few months later, Megan announced she was pregnant. Their first child was a boy, and they named him Thomas. A few years later, their daughter Elizabeth was born, named after Megan's mother. Life settled into a routine. They bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Megan advanced in her career, and Kyle became the principal of a new middle school. But something didn't feel right, and Kyle couldn't shake that feeling. At first, he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. They still talked about everyday things, kids, bills, household chores, but the more important conversations about the future, about dreams, had vanished. Megan, who once enthusiastically planned a cross-country trip, now brushed off the idea every time Kyle brought it up. The little things gradually wore Kyle down. How Megan avoided eye contact when they discussed the future. How her behavior subtly changed. Kyle tried convincing himself he was overreacting, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Underneath the surface, everything was wrong. This was before the era of smartphones, GPS tracking, and digital surveillance. Kyle had no way of tracking Megan's whereabouts, and hiring a private investigator felt wrong and financially impossible, especially when Megan controlled the family finances. Kyle's name rarely appeared on their joint credit card statements, and Megan mostly managed the finances with cash. Her reassurances about their financial situation sounded increasingly hollow. Kyle's role as principal kept him busy year-round with various school events, but as he spent more time at home, his suspicions about Megan's activities grew. He began to wonder if their young neighbor, Jenny, babysat the kids too often. It occurred to him how easily Megan could hide an affair, given their separate careers. Kyle even talked to his son about infidelity, explaining that affairs could range from fleeting flings to long-term relationships in distant cities, often involving power imbalances. After all, Kyle was just a teacher, while Megan worked among doctors, practically gods compared to their modest working-class background. How could he compete with someone like a pediatric oncologist? Kyle had met Dr. David Rodriguez, one of Megan's colleagues, at several community events. He had no reason to suspect the divorced doctor. Blinded by trust, Kyle missed all the warning signs. It wasn't until basketball season, when Megan became careless, that Kyle began to piece things together. Her schedule had always been predictable, Friday nights with friends, but suddenly, she started disappearing on other days as well. As Kyle spent more time at home, he couldn't help but notice the inconsistencies. Watching her return from these so-called girls' nights felt like watching a student trying to cheat on an exam. Kyle had sensed for a while that something wasn't right. At first, he chalked it up to Megan being overwhelmed with work or life's burdens, but as time passed, it became impossible to ignore the obvious. People like Megan, who think they can hide their mistakes, usually follow a predictable path. At first, they're cautious, even vigilant, but then their confidence grows, and that's when the cracks start to show. Megan was no exception. She had let her guard down, and Kyle could no longer pretend not to notice. It wasn't just the faint smell of alcohol lingering on her clothes, or the way she passed him and the kids without even acknowledging their presence. No, it was her aura, her behavior, which practically screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Megan, who had once been impeccable in everything, every outfit perfectly chosen, makeup always flawless, now looked as if she had been caught in a downpour. The first few times, Kyle held back, choosing silence over confrontation. But he couldn't stay silent forever. The signs accumulated, and one evening, he could no longer hold it in. "Megan," he began, forcing his voice to sound calm, though it felt unnatural. "Why are you always coming home so late?" She barely turned to face him, her eyes glazed over, clearly drunk. "What are you even talking about?" she slurred, her voice so garbled it almost seemed genuinely surprised. "Look at yourself." Kyle pointed to her disheveled appearance. "Where have you been? You look like you've been dragged through the mud." "With friends," she mumbled, her speech a drunken mess. Kyle felt his patience slipping, the last thread of control snapping. "With who? What friends, Megan?" he pressed. She listed a few names, most of which Kyle recognized, except one, David Rodriguez. The name hit him like a hammer, piercing through her muddled excuses. "Megan, you're not okay," he continued, trying to keep his composure, though suspicion was gnawing at him. "Tell me what's really going on." For a moment, something flickered in Megan's eyes. Whether it was the alcohol or the weight of her lies, Kyle couldn't tell, but her next words were sharp, merciless. "Come on, Kyle. You know, don't pretend you don't." Kyle's heart clenched. "No," he said, though his heart was pounding. "I don't know." And then she said it. "Me and Dr. Rodriguez, Kyle. You know everything now." The world around him seemed to warp. Nothing felt real anymore. His head spun, as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. "What are you trying to say, Megan?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Kyle. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Denial washed over Kyle, but deep down, he knew the truth had finally surfaced. Megan kept talking, her words spilling through sobs. "It's happening with Dr. Rodriguez. We didn't plan this, but we love each other." In that moment, Kyle's entire world collapsed. Everything he thought he knew about his marriage, his life, crumbled into dust. He wanted to say something, anything, to stop this catastrophic moment, but all that came out was a choked whisper. "You're leaving me." It wasn't a question. He already knew the answer. In one moment, he had a wife, a family, a sense of normalcy. In the next, everything slipped through his fingers like sand. Megan sat before him, her face smeared with makeup and regret, smelling of alcohol and guilt. "Yes, Kyle," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I think so." She tried to soften her expression, but Kyle saw right through her. He had seen this look before, in students trying to feign remorse. Her voice trembled as she added, "I love you, Kyle. Really, but I'm not in love with you anymore." Those words hit him, knocking the ground from beneath his feet. It was a cliché from a bad movie, but it was his reality. And as the shock began to fade, it transformed into something far more dangerous, pure, unrestrained rage. Kyle's gaze swept across the room and landed on Megan's favorite cabinet, the one she adored. It was filled with delicate trinkets she had collected over the years. Before he knew what he was doing, he crossed the room and yanked the door open. His hands reached for the fragile items, family heirlooms. One by one, He hurled them against the walls, watching as they shattered on impact. Megan's screams barely registered in his mind. She begged him to stop, but Kyle no longer heard her. The destruction had only just begun. Kyle found an outlet for his rage in anything that came within reach. First, the television was struck, then the stereo system, and finally, the framed painting on the wall. One by one, these objects succumbed to his fury, turning into debris under the force of his destructive power. Then he stormed into the dining room. Fine porcelain, wedding gifts, crystal glasses, all shattered into pieces, gleaming shards covering the floor. His gaze landed on their wedding photograph. The image showed a happy couple, their faces glowing with joy, as if it was from a distant, different life. He tore the photograph out of the frame and ripped it into pieces, scattering the fragments in some distorted celebration. "It's all over!" he yelled, throwing the torn pieces into the air. The kitchen was next. Chairs flew like weapons, plates like projectiles, and even the expensive faucet that Megan had insisted on wasn't spared from destruction. Megan followed him, crying and begging, but her words couldn't reach him. Kyle was beside himself, unreachable. He smashed one plate after another, one glass after another, unsure if any of it mattered to him at all. He yanked open the fridge, pulling out everything he could find and tossing it to the floor. Milk mixed with iced tea, creating a sticky mess, while pieces of chicken scattered across the linoleum. And then, suddenly, it all stopped. Kyle froze, seeing his children standing in the doorway, their faces pale with terror. That sight broke him in a way nothing else could. Megan's voice changed, no longer pleading, but calm. She simply told him to leave. Numb and defeated, Kyle gathered a few belongings and left. He found temporary shelter, then settled close to the family home. 27 years later, that night still played in his mind, especially when he thought about how he could explain it all to his son. Megan wasted no time filing for a restraining order, hiring lawyers. During the legal proceedings, Kyle searched for answers, but when Megan finally spoke, her words cut him to the core. Without hesitation, she admitted she had never truly loved him and coldly recounted her affairs without any regret. This confession left him devastated, but Kyle sensed a hint of insincerity in her cruelty. It seemed like she had rehearsed her words in advance, as if she was fighting her own inner demons. By the end of her speech, the anger he once felt evaporated, leaving only emptiness. Megan, the woman he had loved for so long, had become a stranger, and this realization showed in his eyes, something she surely noticed. The divorce drained him emotionally. Megan kept the house and half of their savings, while Kyle agreed to fair alimony and limited time with the children. Swallowing his pride, he let her keep her job and her new life, hoping to avoid further conflict. His attempt to say goodbye one last time failed, and their relationship completely fell apart when Megan turned the children against him. Yet, amid the chaos, there were glimmers of hope. Kyle's family helped him get a modest apartment, and Megan's quick remarriage and subsequent pregnancy gradually brought the children back to him. However, his career became a battleground of rumors and ruined reputation. His self-esteem crumbled, sending him into a spiral of meaningless affairs and destructive behavior for 6 months. He tried to rebuild by flaunting his new single status, but this only deepened his misery. And when he hit rock bottom, a ray of hope appeared in the form of Miss Wilson, a red-haired teacher from school. One day she walked past his office, catching his attention amid his despair. She stopped, turned, and confidently walked in, closing the door behind her. In that moment, Kyle felt like his life was about to change again. She sat across from him, her posture relaxed. "Kyle," she began, without any formalities, "I know you're in pain. Let me help you." Her familiarity startled him, and he straightened up in his chair, his defenses rising at her informal use of his name. "Miss Wilson," he responded, emphasizing her title. "I'm fine. Do you need something?" Her smile was warm, almost disarming, and she began a speech that left Kyle speechless. "Mr. Johnson, Kyle, I'm 35, I'm not a supermodel, I have a 6-year-old daughter and an ex-husband who barely shows up. But I know I can help you." Kyle tried to protest, but she continued. "I've been where you are now. You're stuck, and you don't know how to get out." He stood, ready to end the conversation and show her to the door. "Listen, Miss Wilson." But she wasn't finished, interrupting him again, her resolve unwavering. "Yes, I know this is completely inappropriate. Family matters should remain private, but I need to explain." Kyle's thoughts were racing, and he struggled to focus on anything but her gaze, which seemed to pierce through him. "Tomorrow," she stated sharply, spinning on her heels and leaving his office before he could say a word. Kyle stood there, bewildered. What had just happened? After a few moments, he started to process the conversation. It could only mean one of three things: a sincere offer of friendship, a strange reaction to some challenge, or something entirely inappropriate. His first instinct was to remove her from her position immediately. His hand hovered over the phone, ready to dial Dr. Miller, his superior. Yet, he hesitated. Removing her could create an even bigger problem. What if she was replaced with someone worse? And what if Miss Wilson was sent to a more difficult school? She wouldn't last a week. Taking a deep breath, Kyle set the phone down. He realized he would have to deal with this on his own. The next day, Miss Wilson appeared at school, and her appearance was impossible to ignore. Gone were her usual drab outfits. She wore a bright green blouse that highlighted her eyes, and a skirt that left little to the imagination. As she walked through the halls, all eyes turned to her. Kyle couldn't help but think, she's clearly aiming for something. Every time he glanced around, she was nearby, lingering near the main office, making her presence known. It was starting to feel ridiculous. As the day came to an end and Kyle was heading to his car, she caught him off guard. "Can you help me with these boxes?" she asked sweetly. After they had loaded her car, she suddenly leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. "See you Friday after school," she whispered. "I'll be waiting for you at the cafe around the corner." Kyle tried to put a stop to it. "This is a bad idea. I could lose my job," he warned her. She just smiled, as if his words amused her. "Only if I file a complaint, and that won't happen," she added with a wink. "You need someone, and I think I could be that person for you." Kyle called her crazy, but she only smiled wider. This was on Wednesday. On Thursday and Friday, Kyle did his best to avoid her, but despite that, he couldn't help but sneak glances at her when she wasn't looking. He had to admit she was attractive, especially compared to his ex. Friday arrived, cold and sharp. Kyle was certain Miss Wilson wasn't foolish enough to stand outside in the freezing weather, expecting him to show up. But curiosity got the best of him. He drove past the cafe just to check, and sure enough, there she was, shivering in the cold. Damn. Kyle pulled into the parking lot, intending to have a serious talk with her and send her back to her car. But the moment she saw him, her face lit up with a smile, and instead of heading back to her car, she led him towards the cafe entrance. Kyle mumbled, "I can't stay long. Maybe just coffee?" She squeezed his hand, her tone playful. "We'll see how it goes." As they sat in a booth, Kyle's thoughts were in disarray. Scandalous relationships between teachers and students had been happening as long as schools had existed, though such things were usually kept under wraps. Over the years, he had encountered situations like this, like when he accidentally stumbled upon a young teacher and the head of the English department in the storage room. They had scattered so quickly that no one ever mentioned it again. Was that what Miss Wilson wanted? Some kind of secret, scandalous affair? Kyle couldn't imagine any other outcome. This would be the only time, he reminded himself. I stopped only because I couldn't leave you in trouble. Her eyes sparkled as she replied, "No, you stopped because you're a gentleman." She leaned closer, her voice almost turning into a whisper. "You know, I've had feelings for you since you moved in. My ex-husband left me and our child just a few weeks before you arrived. He didn't break me with the divorce, but his cruel words left scars. Miss Wilson's eyes glistened for a moment with restrained tears. I've watched you with your children. You looked so happy, so complete. I'm sorry, but after your wife left, I couldn't help but feel drawn to you. I don't know the full story, but I can guess what happened. Her hand reached across the table and rested on Kyle's hand. Let me be there for you. Kyle couldn't deny it. Miss Wilson was completely open. No mask, no hidden agenda. But despite that, Kyle felt he had to clarify the situation. Miss Wilson, I truly appreciate your care and attention, but to be honest, I don't see you in a romantic light. She threw her head back and laughed. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I'm not used to being seen in that light, and I don't expect it. I'm offering friendship, nothing more. You and I are similar, Kyle. I've been through my struggles. We could help each other. I really do think I could be a support for you. Kyle was stunned. First, he realized his words had hurt her, though he hadn't meant to. She attracted the attention of many men, including students. Second, he wondered if she really only wanted friendship. And third, perhaps he really did need her support. He quickly tried to soften his words. I didn't mean to say you're not attractive. You are very attractive. Under different circumstances, I would certainly be interested. But we work together. I'm responsible for running this school. Yes, we can be friends, but we need to maintain professional boundaries. She nodded, a slight smile appearing on her lips. Let's arrange a meeting with the kids. I'll bring my daughter, and you can bring your children. We'll talk. Kyle noticed the small details. How long her eyelashes were, her emerald earrings, how a strand of her red hair fell across her face. He struggled with the urge to brush that strand away. All right, he said. Pick a time and day. Miss Wilson looked up and then back at him. Not this weekend. How about next Saturday? You choose the place and activity. No, Kyle interrupted. You choose. She smiled. No, you're the man. The choice is yours. Kyle hadn't heard words like that in a long time, and they filled him with a sense of pride. All right, next Saturday it is. I'll let you know the plan within the week. They both stood up and shook hands. Kyle walked her to her car, an old, worn vehicle, a stark contrast to Megan's choice of cars. They shook hands again, and Kyle helped her into the car, watching as she drove off. But as soon as she disappeared from sight, doubt began to creep into his soul. Kyle glanced at the clock, realizing he needed to hurry home before the kids arrived. Later that night, after making sure they were asleep, he made the mistake of going through old photographs of Megan. When she left, she had only taken the pictures of the kids, leaving behind the wedding album. As he flipped through the pages, a wave of nostalgia washed over him, and soon his eyes filled with tears. He knew he had to act. What had begun with Miss Wilson had to come to an end. On Monday morning, while Kyle was on duty in the hallway, Miss Wilson came by to pick up her mail. His expression must have betrayed his thoughts because she immediately seemed uncomfortable. Kyle hesitated, unsure of what to do. Overcoming his indecision, he forced a broad smile and approached her. Good morning, he said, overly cheerful, his voice louder than usual, not caring who might overhear. There's an ice rink near my house. Maybe we could go skating with the kids and then have lunch at my place? Teachers and students walked by, pretending not to notice, but it was clear they were listening in. By the end of the day, the whole school would be buzzing with whispers about Mr. Johnson and Miss Wilson. She still looked unsure, probably confused by his previous expression. I've never been skating, she admitted hesitantly. Kyle extended his hand, lightly touching her palm. That's even better. I'll teach you. In that moment, her defenses dropped, and a genuine smile spread across her face. Okay, let's do it, she agreed. The next day, During the monthly staff meeting, Miss Wilson walked into the cafeteria. Kyle discreetly nodded toward the seat beside him. She got the hint and sat ahead. Kyle had decided he wouldn't hide anymore. People would gossip anyway, so why not let them? He wanted everyone to understand it was about friendship, not scandal. The meeting dragged on, with department heads droning about various things and the sports director airing his usual complaints. When Kyle opened the floor for questions, the same issues came up. Why isn't the dress code being enforced? Why don't students clean up after themselves in the cafeteria? I refuse to attend any meetings that begin with prayer. Kyle listened patiently, reminding everyone to check the local radio station for school closure announcements. He ended the meeting by reminding them to focus on teaching. As he glanced around the room, Kyle's thoughts began to wander. He recalled the endless debates about prayer in school, several colleagues who irritated him, and a group he privately referred to as the rule police, who seemed to take pleasure in catching students breaking rules. He remembered one teacher in particular. She couldn't teach to save her life, but knew every rule inside out. Kyle recalled an incident where she triumphantly brought a little girl to him, pointing out the girl's leather jacket, which was against school policy. The girl was nearly in tears. "Mr. Johnson, it's suede, not leather," she whispered. Kyle gently took the jacket from her. "It's all right, sweetheart." Then, looking straight at the overly strict teacher, he said, "You heard her. It's suede." The teacher stormed off in anger, while the students in the hallway barely contained their laughter. Later that day, someone left a printout on Kyle's desk with the definition of suede highlighted in bright yellow. A true professional. And then there were the prayer advocates, a group of senior teachers who insisted every meeting begin with a heartfelt, "Dear Lord." Personally, Kyle didn't mind, but it annoyed some of the younger staff. A few even threatened to boycott the meetings if the prayers continued. In response, Kyle calmly reassigned them to cafeteria duty, the most dreaded task in the entire school. He quietly chuckled to himself, imagining them trying to avoid flying food and mystery meat for 25 minutes every day. Why did his thoughts drift to such petty annoyances? Perhaps because many of them particularly disliked Miss Wilson. Poor Victoria was constantly being called in by the assistant principals because of her unorthodox teaching methods. She had the nerve to conduct mock trials in class. Victoria Wilson had a unique ability to connect with her students. She organized interesting field trips, allowed them to take breaks during lessons when needed, and genuinely cared about their well-being. Everything in her approach contrasted with the detached attitude of some other teachers. Her creativity, kindness, and deep dedication made her stand out. Kyle found himself increasingly drawn to her. He convinced himself that as long as they kept everything within appropriate boundaries, no one would think anything inappropriate. After all, couldn't a man just have a friend? But as their communication developed, the boundaries began to blur. Their trip to the ice rink was filled with awkward but fun moments. Kyle hadn't skated since his divorce, and Elizabeth had never been on the ice before. Surprisingly, Thomas was the only one who stayed on his feet most of the time. Victoria and her daughter Lily weren't much better, unsteadily balancing on their skates. Even Kyle fell a couple of times, but it was the most fun he had had in years. After skating, they all gathered at Kyle's house, made homemade pizza, and watched Disney cartoons. Even Thomas, who usually considered himself too grown up for such things, joined in the fun. Before Kyle could realize it, his friendship with Victoria had grown into something more. They were now dating. However, Victoria had one clear rule: all their meetings had to include the children. She was determined to ensure that their relationship encompassed Kyle's children as well. Victoria made it clear that she had no intention of replacing their mother, but wanted to support Kyle and his family in any way she could. Kyle kept waiting for something to go wrong, but it didn't. His life was only getting better. One evening, while writing notes for his son, he realized that much about Victoria remained a mystery to him. Who was this woman who had become such an important part of his life? Thomas knew bits and pieces of her story, but there were still many questions. Kyle remembered the painful days after the divorce, the crushing loneliness, anger, and constant self-doubt that haunted him. It was the kind of despair that can completely drain a person. He kept asking himself what had gone wrong. Was he not a good enough provider, a father, a husband? Megan, his ex-wife, had never given him clear answers. Kyle desperately wanted some closure, an explanation, but he never got it. Yet Victoria seemed to understand all of this without needing words. It was as if she could see into his heart in a way that even he couldn't. Letting her into his life hadn't been easy for him. His trust in women had been shattered. He had even conducted a background check on her after their first serious date. The results were unremarkable. She had attended a state university just like him. She was younger and had a daughter, but there was no mention of a former husband. This missing piece of her life made Kyle wonder whether her story of a difficult divorce was true or just a convenient excuse. His paranoia led him to drive past her apartment several times, checking if other men were visiting her or if she spent her evenings in bars. The process of rebuilding trust was torturous for him, but Victoria was patient. She never rushed him. Their early dates were simple: dinners at inexpensive restaurants, trips to the movies. Kyle wasn't extravagant, and he knew it, but he needed to be sure of who she was before giving too much of himself. What he eventually learned surprised him. It was like seeing an old story in a completely new light. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Victoria opened up to him. They spent yet another evening together, content and absorbed in each other. Like Kyle, she had fallen in love back in school. Kyle often heard rumors about those going through a midlife crisis who were drawn to flashy, impractical sports cars, especially exotic foreign ones, that seemed more about showing off than actual utility. But Kyle never chased after trends. He remained loyal to his dependable American car, preferring practicality over spectacle. Victoria had been through her own storm with her ex-husband. He might have been a decent salesman, but as a partner, he was a complete failure, and as a lover too. Only after their wedding did she fully grasp the meaning of the phrase, "mission accomplished, time to rest easy." He never laid a hand on her, but the warmth, affection, and emotional connection she longed for simply weren't there. When she finally packed her things and moved back to her parents' house, her ex made a last-ditch attempt to take their daughter away from her. That's when Victoria's father stepped in, securing a court order, and her uncle found her an experienced lawyer. In the end, her ex-husband backed off, and the divorce was finalized. Victoria was left on her own to figure out how to raise her daughter Lily as a single mother. But her parents didn't let her face it alone. With her mother's support, especially when Lily was still an infant, Victoria found a solid foundation to start her life anew. As she shared her story with Kyle, he couldn't help but notice how much simpler his split with Megan had been. His breakup with Megan lacked the drama that clouded Victoria's divorce. Megan and her new partner, Dr. Boyd Toy, never made him fear for his safety or tried to take the kids away. He was spared the cruel games Victoria had endured. And during these conversations, Kyle began to feel something new, something both thrilling and frightening. He was falling in love with Victoria, and it was happening quickly. The thought of opening his heart again after the pain he'd been through scared him, but it seemed as though Victoria could see right through him. She told him about her ex-husband's unpredictable behavior, how he would swing from making cutting remarks about finding someone prettier and richer to sobbing, claiming she was too good for him and that he could never meet her expectations. Eventually, her ex revealed the truth. He had been unfaithful, and more than once. He had become addicted to deceit, confessing to numerous affairs. He told Victoria she was too boring, and the thought of being with her forever was unbearable. As Kyle listened to her recount the painful details, He couldn't help but remember Megan's hollow excuses when their marriage fell apart. It seemed like cheaters followed the same script, repeating the same tired justifications. But one thing was clear in both Victoria's ex-husband and Megan's cases. They didn't deserve the love they had been given. Processing Victoria's story, Kyle began to understand why Megan had left him. It wasn't about money, career, or social status. Deep down, Megan knew that Kyle had been the better one in their relationship. It wasn't that Kyle hadn't been good enough. It was Megan. With this new realization, he convinced Victoria to leave her apartment and move in with him, bringing little Lily along. Soon, they gathered the children to discuss their future. The kids took the news surprisingly well, and before long, Kyle and Victoria began planning their wedding. The ceremony was small and intimate, just as they wanted, only their parents, Kyle's siblings, and a few close friends from their circle of teachers. Everything was simple, but perfect. Kyle adored Victoria completely. She was his second chance at happiness, the partner he had always dreamed of, and he was certain she felt the same. Over time, Kyle's feelings toward Megan softened. The anger that had once burned within him was replaced by pity. While his life flourished, Megan seemed to be spiraling downhill. She already had a child with Dr. Rodriguez, but rumors suggested he hadn't lived up to her expectations either. The latest gossip was that Megan had found herself another man, this time a highly respected cardiologist. Kyle couldn't believe it. He and Megan had dated for 6 years and were married for 15 before she left him, and her relationship with Rodriguez hadn't even lasted 2 years. Clearly, something was wrong, but one thing was obvious. Megan was deeply unhappy. Had she divorced again and found happiness with this new man? That's what the rumors said, and apparently, she was more content than ever. But knowing Megan, Kyle couldn't help but wonder how long that contentment would last. He had learned his lesson. He wasn't going to waste any more time trying to figure her out. Kyle once believed that he could control everything, but one day he saw it all fall apart right before his eyes. Now, he understood that fate had given him a rare second chance, and he was determined not to let it slip away. Victoria had somehow become an integral part of his family, but there were parts of her story that Thomas needed to know. Kyle vividly remembered the suffocating loneliness that engulfed him after the divorce, and how bitterness almost consumed him entirely. His mind was plagued by doubts, questions about where he had gone wrong. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.